Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Sunday School Dropouts podcast. We're so excited to have you with us today.
Yes, we are very excited. This is a really good episode that we have for y'all today. I am particularly excited for this conversation because we recorded it a little bit before we are recording this intro, and this conversation has stuck with me since we had it. It was pretty profound. I loved it.
Yeah, same. It stuck with me too, and also it's just felt very relevant to a lot of the experiences I've had in my adult life. Which
Yeah.
we'll get into that more.
Yeah,
But
yes,
yeah,
yeah. So for those who haven't read the show notes or anything, we have a guest today with us, Michelle Mosley, who we will introduce to you very shortly. But we are going to be talking today about purity culture and neurodivergence, which might sound like two very different topics at the outset of it. But as you'll see when we get into this conversation, there is a huge crossover. We talk a little bit about why purity culture might feel actually like a really nice framework for some people with neurodivergence, as well as how folks with neurodivergence might be more easily controlled or shamed by purity culture and systems of high control religion and relationships. So yeah, like I said, this conversation has stuck with me since we had it with Michelle. So I am very excited for everybody else to learn. And even if neurodivergence is not something that you personally identify with, I think it would be so helpful to listen to anyways, just because complex trauma can sometimes function in the brain similarly to neurodivergence. And so I just think that anybody who's listening will get so much out of this conversation. So yeah, it'll be good for people to hear that in a few moments.
before we get started, just our quick disclaimer: we recognize that some of the topics we discuss in any episode may bring up feelings, emotions, and triggers that may require more processing or be too much to handle right now. So please always feel free to skip any episode or parts of episodes and come back if and when you are ready. Our goal is to help you trust your own body and lived experience, so take what you need and leave what you don't.
All right, we have a story from one of our listeners, and they say, I was not sexually abused, but I prayed to God regularly that he would reveal my sexual abuse as a child that I thought I didn't remember because I masturbated and was horny as a teenage girl. I didn't understand that it was normal, so I thought something must be wrong when I actually had normal sexuality.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Honestly, on behalf of this person, it quite honestly just makes me mad. Whatever teacher, pastor, whoever
Yeah.
communicated that things that are developmentally normal and healthy are signs of abuse. Especially given, unfortunately, how rampant actual abuse in the church is. That's ironic, but yeah, I'm just really sorry that you went through that, first and foremost.
I remember hearing that line of thinking because for women in particular, since we were not supposed to be sexually interested or interested in sexual activities, if
Right.
we were engaging in something like that, then it was indication that something had happened when we were earlier, because otherwise we wouldn't want to be engaging in these sexual activities because we're not sexual beings. So it means something must have happened. And I remember that was definitely a part of my way of understanding things as I was growing up inside of that culture too. And I remember then working with middle and high school students, mostly middle school students, but like I would know them up through their high school years or whatnot, some of them. And having their parents come to me and say, hey, I found this, person or whatever, they're doing this or that or whatever. And that was one of my first thoughts is like, were they sexually abused? Is there some sort of sexual abuse that we are not aware of? And now, obviously, in hindsight, it's like, no, that was like totally developmentally appropriate, and it was just looked at in such a really despicable way.
Yeah. I have so many thoughts. We don't really have time to get into all of it, probably. Just this whole thing. Because also there's like the whole idea too of like there's, being like abuse that you don't remember.
Yes.
And yes, that certainly can be a thing. And also we know from research that I forgot the exact terminology for this, but like basically it's like trying to find and dredge up repressed stuff can absolutely create false memories that never actually
Yes.
happened. It's not
Yes.
exactly something that a psychologist or psychiatrist that's
Mm-hmm.
ethical is going to be
Mm-hmm.
pushing you toward,
Yeah.
you know? And
Yeah.
so just the idea
Yeah.
that something that is developmentally normal is the reason you should now be seeking out repressed abuse that you just don't
Mm-hmm.
remember.
Mm-hmm.
It's all levels of harmful.
Yeah. I think that's why I like somatic work so much and being trained as a somatic therapist is that I've never, even before I had my somatic training, I've never been a memory digger. Like I never tried to dig things up for clients or anything like that. But I'm just such a firm believer that your body will bring those things up to the forefront of your mind or physiological symptoms and symptoms and things like that, or sorry, sensations and symptoms if your body is ready to process through them. And so we as a therapist or as a coach or a somatic worker or whomever, we or even as just a person, we don't have to necessarily go digging for all of this stuff. Our body will reveal that if and when necessary. But yeah, I know what statistic you're talking about, Andrew. And actually I was just reading a book the other day talking about that, like how harmful that is to make that assumption of this is my behavior, so clearly this must have happened, and so now I have to dig around and maybe find something that didn't happen, when in reality, like in this case or whatnot, yeah, it was very normal sexuality and sexual activity just being vilified and shamed by a system that wants to control, perhaps not because
Mhm.
something happened in this case. I don't want to speak for everybody.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, for this
Hmm.
particular story, the irony is the harm that happened is hiding in plain sight. The harm is being told that there was something
Yeah,
wrong.
that's the
Masturbation
harm. That's the abuse.
being
Yeah, yeah.
you're a teenager, that's kind of part of puberty
Hmm.
oftentimes,
Yeah.
so
Yes. Yes. I get it.
so here are some of our listener questions. The first one we have is, how do I start talking to my therapist about this if they don't get it?
Ah, yes. Okay. So I'm assuming talking about this, meaning like purity culture. And that can be really hard because while I do think that there is a larger cultural conversation happening where terms like purity culture are being understood outside of religious or post-religious circles, I think that there are still a great many amount of therapists that you might say the word purity culture and they're like, I have no idea what that is. And that can be really frustrating to feel like you're having to educate your therapist and spend your time and money and efforts and energy educating them for this thing that they are supposed to help you with. There is an amount of like normal explanation that you might need to give your therapist about anything that's going on in your life, including these dynamics, right? So that would be very normal. And so that could be a way to start talking to them about this. Like, here's what it was, here is what the impact was that it's having on me, or I don't even know what the impact is, but here's what I see, what's coming up in my life. And if they take you seriously, which hopefully they do, that might be an indicator that they're a good fit for you, because even if they don't know the ins and outs, they're willing to learn. You could also ask your therapist, like, would you be okay if I sent you some Instagram accounts or websites or books or articles or podcasts that go into greater depth explaining what purity culture is, and would you listen to it so that you are understanding? And a lot of therapists will say yes, that they will, because they're wanting to know what it is that their clients are trying to navigate. If you get resistance from your therapist, it may just be that they're not a good fit for you, whether that's for that specific topic or just you as like they're not going to be a good fit for you to do work with. So you could always find somebody a little bit more specialized. One of the nice things about the practitioners at the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery is this right here, is that a lot of our clients will say, it's so nice, I don't even have to explain anything to you. You just know, you get it. And that can feel really helpful. But that's not for everybody. And we have a limited amount of coaches, right? And there's many more people. And so I think just like starting to broach the conversation and see, how do they respond to me when I'm sharing what my experience is? Are they open to learning more? Can I kind of give them some resources or point them in a direction, and then continue to navigate it in your sessions? But Andrew, what do you think about this?
I definitely agree with what you said, like, if they are open to it, like offering resources and then just gauging how they respond to that. I think most
Mm-hmm.
therapists, one of two things: either they're going to be open to doing that, or they will then be honest and be like, this maybe just goes beyond my scope of practice.
Yeah.
And maybe it's just a thing where they just don't, it's beyond their scope of practice and somebody else just may be a better fit. And I
Mm-hmm.
feel like most ethical therapists or even coaches for that matter should be aware of what their limitations are. And if something is so outside of their scope of practice that it would just be to everybody's benefit, I feel like at that point they should say that essentially, and
Mm-hmm.
then refer you to somebody else, or even if they don't know who somebody else, help you find somebody else who then does specialize more with what you're looking for. But that's how I would start with it. It's like, treat it like a collaborative. It's a collaborative
Mm-hmm.
approach, with a therapist. And
Yeah.
yeah, if they're getting defensive and kind of just giving you pushback, which I hope they wouldn't. I think a lot
Mm-hmm.
of therapists wouldn't, but if they do,
Mm-hmm.
that's a bit of a red flag. So
Yeah. I know I have had several clients in the past where they will work with me specifically about things around purity culture or the impact of high control religion. And they also have another therapist that they work with specifically for other things. Maybe it's anxiety, depression, or whatnot. And
mhm.
so the work we're doing is much more tailored to those experiences. And that is in part because their therapist doesn't know about these dynamics. And it's not that they couldn't or wouldn't learn, but they're not able to speak to them in a way that that client would prefer. So I've experienced that a lot too, where they'll come to me as a coach and do some somatic experiencing around those things, and then work with a different therapist on some of the other life stuff, relationships, boundaries, things like that.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, absolutely. And I can real quick speak to, like, I do know firsthand of a few therapists who I think have been very responsible and ethical and have, like,
hmm
maybe they're working with a client with like for EMDR or
yes.
OCD specifically,
Yep.
like that is their specialization. But then when it came to like religious trauma stuff, high control systems and all of that, they were like, I don't really, that's not my wheelhouse. And
hmm
then they referred to us. And so it ends up kind of being like almost like a tag team of, like, they're kind of working
Yeah.
with both of us simultaneously, but for different reasons.
hmm Yeah. Okay. Well, let's go on to the next question. And it is there a way to feel desire without also feeling guilt or fear?
Oof, that's a good question.
hmm
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes.
hmm
The longer, more nuanced answer is I realize those of us who grew up in purity culture where you were told that your body was not okay, was bad, and especially in that sexuality, sexual arousal. I mean, just like a little while ago, we were talking about the shame around, like, a teenager carried for masturbating and being horny, which were very developmentally
hmm
normal things to experience as a human being going through puberty. So, you get these neural pathways where it's like, yeah, you experience arousal and then you also experience
hmm
shame that goes right along with it because of the programming that you were given. So it does take intentional work. And I think it takes a lot of body based, somatic based, trauma informed work, not just cognitive behavioral therapy, in other words,
hmm
to work through that. But yeah, I do think there is absolutely a way that you can get to feeling desire without also feeling those other things. The one thing I would add in terms of, like, okay, well, where do I start, is I wouldn't start with the intention of trying to feel desire or arousal. I would actually start
hmm
something much less threatening in terms of just
hmm
notice, like just starting at basic building blocks of feeling safe in your own
hmm
body, noticing what your body's feeling outside of
hmm
the context of desire. I'm like, well, that can be built up to. But I think
Yeah.
oftentimes where I see things go sideways, or maybe not go sideways, but just folks aren't getting the progress they want to in therapy or in some of this work is, you have some issues around sexuality and you go in and you're like, all right, let's dive right into the sexuality.
hmm
And that's
Yeah.
probably not going to work out real well. That's going to be like too much, too fast, and be
hmm
dysregulating. And that's why I say kind of start with the basic building blocks and build up to that rather than trying to
hmm
dive right into the desire piece right out of the gate.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is like, and I know we've talked about this in other episodes as well, is like when we're talking about things like desire or pleasure, I think in a lot of high control religious contexts, that is overcoupled with sex. And so it's automatically like, if I'm talking about pleasure, that I must be talking about sex. And while you absolutely can experience pleasure as a result of sex or sexual activity, that's not the only thing you can experience from pleasure or desire. And so when I think about things like this, how do I feel desire without also feeling guilt or fear? Maybe start with things that aren't necessarily sexual or sexual in nature. So, how do I know that I desire to go and watch a movie or listen to this kind of music? Can I notice, like, what do I want in any given situation, whether it's what I'm going to eat for breakfast or how I'm going to move my body or who I'm going to spend my time with or things like that? And just notice what you're drawn to. And that is also desire. Like, what are you desiring? What are you compelled to move towards? And using your senses. And it really can be like, what are the things that I like to feel against my skin? Like what types of clothing, right? Or what are the smells that I like? Is there a specific perfume or scent that, oh, I smell it and I'm just like, oh, I really love that, right? And so starting with things that are not necessarily sexual can help you start to uncouple this belief that sex and desire, sex and pleasure, like those are the only things that go together. And when you start to feel that desire or that pleasure in non-sexual ways, there's also a likelihood that you won't feel the guilt or fear with it. So you're giving your body new experiences of desire, of pleasure that aren't automatically inducing that guilt or fear. So, as Andrew was saying, as you're getting into your body in ways that are a little bit safer or less threatening than just plunging into all of the sexual stuff, like add those little pieces of of desire and pleasure in there that have nothing to do with sex and sexuality, and slowly start building towards, sexual desire, sexual pleasure, things like that. But oftentimes, to echo what Andrew was saying, I find with my clients that we have to go very slow at first in order to go faster later on. And so don't diminish or downplay those, how important it can be to get into your body, to feel safe in your body, to know the things that you like, that you take joy or pleasure in. Even before we introduce sex and sexuality, those things will not be wasted when we are at the point where your nervous system can handle kind of going more into those sexual spaces.
I agree entirely.
Awesome. Well, good questions, y'all. Keep them coming.
Another one of our listener stories. So, our pastor told us that when he was dating his now wife, they would never be seen alone together in case someone could think they were having sex. So, after a date, if a roommate wasn't home, they would sit on the front step until someone could be in the house with them. It's all about caring what people think, disguised as purity culture. Oh, my God.
Yeah. I
Like,
totally get
all right, Billy
this.
Graham.
Yeah, I know. I was going to say this is like a version of the Billy Graham rule or the Mike Pence rule or, whatever. Yeah, I totally bought into this. I can't tell you how many times. Yeah. And it wasn't even with somebody I was dating, right? If it was just somebody of the opposite gender, then we couldn't be in the house together by ourselves. There had to always be a third person in order to make sure that there wasn't even an appearance of evil. Yes,
Yeah.
I was great. And I was the third in a lot of cases where I was the one who would go, be that extra person for the other person so that, there was no hint of evil.
Oh, yeah, that's such a thing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Being above the appearance of evil was a phrase I heard a lot.
Yes.
Whereas
Mm-hmm.
like, yeah, it's really caring about what people think. It's like it's not even about
Mm-hmm.
what you actually are or aren't doing. It's what is the
Mm-hmm.
appearance? What's the
Yeah.
perception?
Yes. Well, and I think with that too, I mean, these are concepts made famous by, Josh Harris, especially in like I Kiss Dating Goodbye and Boy Meets Girl, is this idea of, it's not just even like sexual, like physical purity, it's emotional purity. You've got to guard your heart. And so, because there was these crazy outlandish ideas about, men and women and could you be friends? And, if you're in the same room as, unmarried man or unmarried woman, you're just like, rip their clothes off or whatever. And so it was even this idea of like, you don't want to be alone with somebody because then you might be leading them to think that maybe you'd want to be in a relationship with them. And then you're not guarding their heart because you're putting them in this precarious situation. And it's just so much performing and so much caring about what other people thought and really setting people up to fail. Like I think about that often now, like how many relationships I was not able to have with men in particular because I wanted to guard their heart and was so afraid that, if I was ever friends with them more than just very, very high level or other people around, then I would, mislead them. And it's like, yeah, I missed out on a lot of really great friendships as a result of that.
I'm just reflecting on I don't know, my whole life. It really is amazing thinking back how it does condition you into how you then, yeah, have friendships
Mm-hmm.
even later in
Yeah.
life and how much, yeah. But anyway, yeah,
Yeah.
basically that's the Billy Graham rule repackaged there.
We love it. We love it. Michelle Mosley is a licensed clinical mental health counselor based in North Carolina, a national certified counselor, and a board certified telemental health counselor. With her own lived experience of spiritual abuse in vocational Christian ministry, Michelle specializes in supporting adults who have been harmed in high control religious settings. Her work centers on healing religious trauma, addressing body image from a weight-inclusive perspective, and empowering late-identified neurodivergent women.
As a late identified autistic woman, she brings deep personal insight to her counseling, helping others navigate the complex intersections of neurodivergence, religious rules, and self acceptance. In addition to providing individual and group therapy, Michelle offers ADHD and autism assessments for adults and develops continuing education trainings for mental health professionals on neurodivergence and religious trauma. You can find her writing and resources at michellefmosley.com and connect with her on social media at therapy_with_Michelle.
Welcome, Michelle, to the Sunday School Dropouts podcast. It is so wonderful to have you here today.
I am so excited to be here.
Yes, I think we are going to have a really amazing conversation about the intersections of neurodivergence and purity culture. As we know, there's so many overlaps, sometimes, with that rigid identity piece. And so I'm excited to talk about that because this is not something that I've heard on many podcasts talking about purity culture and religious trauma and neurodivergence. So like I said before we started recording, I was so excited when you brought this idea to me and so excited that you would join us today. So thank you for being here. And to get us started, I wonder if you would be okay to share with us just a little bit about your own story inside of high control religion and kind of like what got you here today, as a therapist specializing in religious trauma and wanting to talk about purity culture and neurodivergence.
Sure. Yeah, I'm really excited to have this conversation as well.
Yes.
So I grew up in a small Baptist church in rural North Carolina. It was not a high control structure, I would say. It was, and not as patriarchal as a lot of Baptist churches, because if women weren't allowed to do things, there was nobody to do things. But it definitely set up the framework for being drawn into some high control context. So it was really as I got into high school and college that I was drawn more high control, rigid things. True Love Waits was really big when I was in high school. I was actually the person that brought it to my high school and my youth.
True believer. Yeah.
Yes. And here is some rules, and this tells us what to do. And I like being told how to relate. And here's your list of things that are allowable and not allowable. Very appealing. I got to college, and I Kissed Dating Goodbye was a real popular book. I was in like a book club from a college ministry that we read that. And of course, I'll commit to that courtship kind of identity. Also, the book Lady in Waiting by Elizabeth Elliot was real popular.
Yes.
So this whole idea of, as a woman, your life is on hold until this man that is following God is ready for you. And I really internalized that,
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I personally felt called to some kind of ministry during college, but for me, that framework was, okay, well, you're going to marry a pastor, and that's going to be your ministry. I didn't marry a pastor, and I got to 25, and I had not married a pastor, and in those contexts, that's pretty old to not be married yet. So I started pursuing other ways to go into ministry. I ended up working with a very well-known college ministry. It is an international ministry. I can't speak to the whole ministry, but I can say that at least in the Southeast, very patriarchal, very high control, very Calvinist theology, getting all of the messages about being depraved since birth and needing to be chosen by God, only certain people are elected for salvation. And that was the context where I experienced spiritual abuse and religious trauma. I didn't have words for it at the time. It played out in some physical health issues, an eating disorder, really impacted my entire world. I ended up leaving that ministry because it got to a point where this is just not doable anymore. And I pursued a graduate degree in mental health counseling, which I had considered post-undergrad, but had decided it wasn't quite religious enough. And so I didn't intend to work with religious trauma when I went back to grad school. I often call it the niche that found me. because I kept
Yeah.
having clients come in talking about harmful experiences, and then they were like, you understand this. You really get this. I also started learning more about neurodivergence and particularly about autism. And this was around the same time that the definition and understanding of autism was expanding. And had my own journey of being late identified in my 40s. And still kind of going through that process of, oh, this makes so much sense now. Why I was drawn to these things, why these things were difficult. So really that's kind of how I ended up where I am today.
I love that. I feel like, I love talking to religious trauma therapists because I feel like we bring so much of our own personal story into it. And that is why we are passionate about this work. But I appreciate you sharing that because it sounds so familiar to so many other people's stories of how we even, got into this field and just like the seriousness with which we took our faith and our beliefs, and really centered our entire lives around being in this ministry and doing what we thought God was calling us to do. So, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. I think that's so
Yeah.
true. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting too. Your story really resonates with me. I mean, well, first of all, I'm also from North Carolina and grew up there. But that aside, I was planning after my undergrad. I was truly planning to go to seminary. Long story short, did not, and went into a grad program for clinical mental health counseling. And the rest is history. Here I am today, right? And so, and also I was diagnosed as an adult like only 3 years ago with ADHD, and I'm also exploring the possibility of there being actually this dual co-occurring with autism. So it's definitely something I've been deep diving, but more from a personal anecdotal side. I'm not professionally trained in that. I don't pretend that's my expertise, but definitely curious. And so actually on that note, that this is actually, because there's so much recently I've seen, and by recently, I mean last 5 to 10 years, there's been such a increase in conversation, especially on social media, TikTok and such, about neurodivergence. And you see that word a lot. And that being said, I'm sure there's also a lot of partially untrue or completely untrue definitions that are floating around up there. So how do you define neurodivergence, and how would you define that, and who all does that actually include?
Yeah. I really appreciate that question because you're right. Neurodiversity is being talked about more and more, and in some spaces really clearly and well, and in some spaces can be really confusing. So I think the first thing is to understand neurodiversity, which is just a part of the natural biodiversity of humans. So anytime you have a group of humans, they are neurodiverse. Whether they are someone's autistic, ADHD, someone is more of what would be considered neurotypical, just a group of people, there's going to be neurodiversity there. When we think about neurodivergence, it was coined as a socio-political term, really to describe a person's standing in their cultural or social context. And so if we think of it that way, it's really neurodivergent is anybody that has a brain that functions in ways that are diverging from what is considered quote unquote typical within their social context. And so really in that broad umbrella, a person who has any mental health diagnosis could fit under that umbrella of neurodivergent. A lot of times now it is used specifically to talk about ADHD and autism, but those are not the only forms of neurodivergent. And I think it's also important to think about like organic or innate neurodivergence. So things that someone is born with. So that would be things like autism, things like ADHD, that these don't develop later in life. You were born with that brain type. But also thinking about acquired neurodivergence. So like TBIs, or CPTSD, like complex trauma. Those are all things that affect how your brain is functioning.
Yeah, I think that I really appreciate you expanding that, and even the difference between neurodivergence and neurodiversity. I think that's really important to understand. I'm curious to know why you might feel like it's important to talk about neurodivergence, especially within the context of religious trauma and purity culture. I have a hunch, like I guess my own story is that I was also late diagnosed ADHD, and I really feel like the religious rigidity was something that helped me kind of not be aware of ADHD, which now I can look back and I'm like, oh my gosh, I totally see it. My poor little, but growing up as a a girl, where they labeled like ADHD as a boy's, diagnosis. Girls really don't have it. It was the 80s. We didn't talk about it the same way that we talk about today. But I can look back now and I see that purity culture and religion, high control religion, really were masks. Like helped me mask some of those things. So that being said, I'm curious to know from you why you feel it is important to talk about neurodivergence when we're having this conversation about purity culture and even religious trauma as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, I think your example from your own story of like that structure and that rigidity really can be attractive to neurodivergent folks, because often neurodivergent folks may struggle with figuring out what is expected, what are the rules, how am I supposed to interact with people, and so if I'm put into a context that tells me how to do that, that can be real attractive. But that context also determines what is seen as kind of quote unquote diverging from the typical, because it is creating the context of this is what is typical. I've worked with so many folks that working through their religious trauma and then realizing, I think I might have ADHD. I think I might be autistic. And then you add in complex trauma or complex PTSD, which a lot of folks who have experienced religious trauma meet the criteria for that. That is a form of neurodivergence in and of itself. So I just see overlaps everywhere. And the more that I look into it, the more I see overlaps.
Yeah. Can you speak to that a little bit more, that overlap between CPTSD and neurodivergence? I think that would be helpful because I would imagine a lot of people would identify with that in this audience.
Yeah. Well, CPTSD, we know that trauma impacts the way that your brain functions, the way that you process memories, the way that you react to things, the way that your body reacts to things. And so that can all be things that then start diverging from what's considered quote unquote typical or normal in your context. And so, if you are, maybe you drive by a church building and suddenly you feel nauseous or you start having a panic attack, like that is something that is not considered typical and can be the result of CPTSD. And be a way that you are experiencing a divergence or neurodivergence. Your brain is reacting.
Yeah, that's so helpful. Thank you for that.
I know that particular question was about CPTSD, but speaking to purity culture specifically, I just am curious if you could speak to like why might purity culture feel particularly appealing or even safe for neurodivergent folks at first?
Yeah. I think because so many neurodivergent folks, and particularly autistic folks, that's my lived experience, so I can speak very specifically from that, are aware of being viewed as different. There's something about me that doesn't quite fit in, so I'm looking for some kind of rules to help me fit in, for some kind of guideline. That is exactly what purity culture is. Like, it is rules and control when you really get down to it. Like, it's wrapped around morality, but it is rules and control. And so it offers those rules. It gives real clear directions around how you're supposed to interact with other people, even how you're supposed to interact with your own body. And that's another thing that for a lot of neurodivergent folks, the experience of being in your body can feel disconnected. There can be differences in interoception, which is knowing what's going on in your body, noticing things like hunger, pleasure, pain, needing to use the restroom, that kind of stuff. And so purity culture labels a lot of that stuff as bad. I'm not supposed to experience pleasure. I'm not supposed to desire things. So if I already don't do that, then purity culture is a place that says, oh, well, you're doing a good job. Like, you fit in here because you're not struggling with those things. And then I think also if a lot of neurodivergent folks maybe somewhere on the sexual experience or sexuality kind of spectrum, there may be, research has shown that it's more likely for neurodivergent folks to be asexual or have differences in like sexual desire. So that can lead to this feeling of like, I belong in purity culture because I can perform this correctly.
Interesting. Yeah. Wow. I'm like putting together some pieces. Whenever I graduated from high school, I mean, I think for most people, that's a very tumultuous time, right? Because you're making that transition in a lot of cases from very structured rules at, home, and then you're going into these environments at college where you're in charge of yourself or your schedule or things like that. And that's when I look back now, and at the time I called it depression. And I think that and you could probably speak to this better, I think for women in particular, it's oftentimes misdiagnosed as depression and anxiety. And so I just thought I'm depressed, but also, probably spiritually weak, because for all the reasons with mental health. But I remember, because again, Josh Harris's book came out around that time, and it was so prescriptive. And I hated the book. I absolutely thought it was garbage. But then I was like, I feel so tumultuous inside me. Like, I don't, like, everything feels like it's caving in. Like, I don't have any stable ground. And it felt like it was a buoy that I could, like, hold on to in this choppy sea, because it gave me this very prescriptive way to live. And yeah, I mean, like, case study for what you just said, that was,
Yeah.
I mean, and I even articulated that to people at the time, but didn't connect that with neurodivergence.
Yeah. Well, I think we had even that language then, like you were saying earlier, if you were a girl growing up in the 80s or 90s, and you were, especially if you were able to do okay in school and you figured out ways to sit still, you might have been going berserk internally, but externally you're sitting still and you're not causing problems, and then you get out of that environment into college where there is more freedom. And I think it's real common to have, okay, everything has fallen apart. Like, it's all just caving in and I don't know what to do now. So I'm reaching for, whatever might buoy me up.
That's, yeah. And my like 19-year-old self appreciates hearing that. So thank you. You talked about, how neurodivergent people find comfort in that structure, predictability. I think we're all in agreement with that here on this podcast. How does that kind of intersect with that black and white thinking that's often found in high control religion? And maybe that's a repeat of the question that we've already asked, but yeah, just speaking even more specifically to high control religion.
Yeah. I mean, there can be, high control religion is black and white thinking. It tells you who is in, who is out, what is right, what is wrong. Like, it's very clear. This is what is supposed to happen. This is what is not supposed to happen. And so I think for folks who desire that, who know that they thrive in that, or have gotten a lot of messages that they need that, because I think a lot of ADHDers have gotten the message of, like, you need somebody to give you structure because you're not capable of doing it yourself. That it can be really attractive going into a situation where there's structure. So I know for me, like, I found a lot of comfort of going into services that I knew had a clear plan of, we're going to read this scripture, and then we're going to sing this many songs, and then this is going to happen, and then there's going to be a sermon that's going to last this long, and then this is the next thing, and then you're going to end with a song. Like, there was something soothing about that I couldn't necessarily name at the time. But I knew when I went into a space where things were different, it wasn't just this is different. It was like my nervous system's on guard. I don't know what to do here. How does this work? Is this still the same? Is this okay? I think being drawn into that. I think also a lot of neurodivergent folks have difficulty with social cues. And so in the purity culture context, but just in my experience, church and religion at large, gives you a lot of guidelines for how you're supposed to socialize with people. So it can lead to some calmness and comfort of this is what I'm supposed to do, but also a feeling of disconnection from yourself if that doesn't naturally align with how you desire to interact with people or your interest. So it can play out all around.
Wow.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And so actually on that note, can you talk about how rigidity can be both a protective trait and also something that can be used against someone, especially in these faith-based high control systems?
Yeah, I mean, that desire for structure, for knowing the plan, for knowing what the rules are, can be protective because it often makes you good at following the rules. I'm not going to get in trouble. I'm not going to be used as an example because I am following the rules. But there also can be a whole lot of shame that gets embedded around maybe how hard you're having to work to try to follow the rules because you see other people that it looks like this comes a lot easier for them. It also can be helpful in giving a guide for situations and interactions. Kind of going back to what I was saying earlier, things that might not come naturally. I know for me, I would often volunteer to be the person that like checked people into the event or gave everybody their information because I had a clear role. I'm here, I'm interacting with people, I'm socializing, I'm doing all the things I'm supposed to do, but I have a very clear role of what I'm supposed to do here. But then you have that heightened awareness of the rules. So when it seems like the rules don't apply to everybody, that can really, really sink into your nervous system and be very hard to understand. Like, okay, well, why do the rules apply here but not here? And when you see people that are acting in ways that seem hypocritical, that they're saying they believe one thing but they're doing something else, that just natural tendency to adhere to the right and wrong kind of dynamic can really get played out of there's no room for gray, for nuance, for understanding that not everybody acts or experiences life the same way because these are the rules. So why are you not following the rules?
Yeah. Michelle, we would have been fighting over the front desk duties if we went to the same church. I loved being the person who's like, yeah, welcome in. Like, here, go do these things. Here's what's coming up. Yeah, we would have been little buddies, you know, trying to do that duty.
Yes.
I never have connected that before, but that is totally it. Yeah. And then when I had to like walk around and greet people, I was like, this is the worst thing that you could ever ask me to do. Just the subjectiveness was too much.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you ever had an experience like this, but for me, sometimes because I would always volunteer for those roles, or I would be the one that would be like, but we said that this was the rule and we're not doing it, that I would be called self-righteous or prideful, which of course is bad.
Yes.
And it's like,
Right.
I'm just trying to figure out how to be a person. Like, what are we doing?
Yeah. The word legalistic comes up. Like that was what you did not want to be called.
Yes.
And yet like Calvinism is like so legalistic. But yeah, if you would have said like, hey, this is how we're supposed to do it, then now you're being legalistic, right?
Yes.
You know, it's like, oh gosh, yeah, the shame that comes with that is huge. Yeah, because you're never quite sure where that line is of like, where's the rule to where's the legalism. And yeah, I totally resonate with that.
Yes.
Yeah.
So hard.
Yeah.
It's so hard to navigate.
So is. Yeah. Andrew, what was it like for you, like growing up, especially in a male body? Was there any similarities or differences?
Well, first of all, for additional context, I grew up in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which is particularly high control. At least I feel like it is. Very unique culture and all that. But no, I mean, it was very similar, I think. I was even just thinking as you were talking about the kind of like recognizing those discrepancies of like rules, like if we're supposed to follow these, everybody follows these. And that being some of the earliest stuff that I had issues with in my church, specifically, like when there would be like, I don't know, like some sort of like abuse scandal or something would happen. And I would recognize that like some of the higher level pastors maybe weren't really being held accountable. They were just kind of being allowed to ride off peacefully and maybe change churches or change conferences or whatever the case. And knowing full well that like at my local church level that this person would have been hung out to dry. Like that wouldn't have flown if it was just a random like person, right? And so just seeing those discrepancies, I just remembering how much they bothered me, and I would bring it up to people and they'd be like, well, yeah, that shouldn't have happened. And you're right. That's upsetting. But I don't know. We've all fallen short of the glory of God and people make mistakes and whatever. And they'd find some pat answer to kind of spiritually gloss over it a little bit. And I remember it bothered me more, I think, than the average person did. And so in hindsight, I don't know, I'm just seeing that with a lot more clarity now.
Yeah. I mean, that resonates so much with my experience of really what I consider the crux of my spiritual abuse, of recognizing things that were happening, but this doesn't seem okay. Leadership is doing this, and this doesn't fit within what we're saying our mission is or our goal. But when I would bring it to somebody's attention, it being glossed over, or I was seen as the problem, when it's like, I'm not trying to be a problem. I just notice this intensely. And so I want to figure out what's happening. And at that time, not having the language for the spiritual abuse that was going on, and also not being aware of my own neurodivergence. Just knowing like, why is this so hard for me? Like everyone else seems like they can just move on, and this is really impacting my life.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, I'm thinking of so many experiences, which different story for a different day. But yeah, I think this is so helpful because, yeah, it kind of leads me to the next question, with this, like with people that are already a bit more prone towards, seeing the world in very structured, literal ways, like what is the cost then for them, being in this high control religion where that becomes fused with their identity and self-worth, these rules of high control religion. And then also I'm already seeing the world as quite literal or quite structured. Yeah. What's the cost of those two things
Yeah.
fusing together?
Oh, I just feel like, kind of as we're saying, you feel it so intensely,
Hmm.
and it is an attack on the way you're making meaning of the world. It is an attack on your identity. It feels like there is this hypocrisy everywhere, but yet it gets mixed with all of this talk about grace and,
Mm.
extending grace to people and believing the best about people. That was a phrase that I heard so much: believe the best, believe the best. And I'm like, okay, but I've
Hmm.
seen 15 examples of this is not the best. It's really hard. Like, are we just denying what's
Mhm.
really happening? And it can lead to folks really questioning, like, is this system wrong? Am I wrong? Am I ever going to be okay? Like, am I acceptable? Am I acceptable to people? Am I acceptable to God? Just constantly questioning all of the time, and really putting your nervous system on that high alert of like, I got to figure out everything because this is not safe. I don't ever feel safe.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. No, that
Yeah.
resonates deeply.
And it strikes me that a lot of shame would likely come up too then. I mean,
Yeah,
constant shame.
constant. Yes.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And to that point, just this idea where you're wondering now, like, is there something wrong with me? Like you're reflecting on all of that. I mean, and then this ties right into the next question, which is about masking, and especially in purity culture
Mhm.
systems. And
Mm.
so, how does masking, whether it's social, emotional, sexual, etc., how does that show up for neurodivergent folks who are trying to survive in purity culture type
Yeah.
systems?
Yeah. I mean, for so many neurodivergent folks, like, masking really is an attempt at survival. Like, it
Yeah.
is done in an attempt to try to fit in, to avoid being harassed or bullied or rejected. And it really can take on a few different ways. Like, the top three that I have heard are like mimicking other people's behaviors to try to fit in and seem like you understand what's happening socially and behaviorally, actively suppressing parts of yourself. So, like, being
Mhm.
aware that you're pushing it down, and then pushing yourself to engage in ways that don't come naturally, that sometimes really are using up all of your capacity.
Mhm.
So I think in purity culture, I think about like mimicking the ways that other people talk about their struggles or their experience with lust, even if it's not your experience. Like, I remember being part of like prayer circles and things, and everybody is talking about the struggle that they're having because they find somebody attractive, or they really want to, kiss their boyfriend or whatever. And a lot of times I was like, I'm not having this, but I know that I need to have this same conversation, because
Yeah.
that's the conversation that everyone is having. And I think about later in my time, because I would say I was still in purity culture into my 30s. I was still working in this high control religion, and I
Mhm.
still was not married at that time. Um,
Mhm.
and I remember very specifically being part of the conversation. I was kind of starting to unmask, even though I didn't have those words yet. And we were talking about like sexual sin. And I was like, I don't have anything to confess. And then that
Mhm.
became a whole conversation of almost like, Michelle, it's not possible that you don't have anything to confess. You're single and you're in your 30s. So, of course, there's sexual sin.
Mm.
Um, and so, I mean,
Hmm.
that sheds light on why a lot of neurodivergent folks are
Yeah.
going to mimic and mask in that way,
Mhm.
suppressing parts of yourself, because there may be things that are very sensory soothing to you, but they get associated with sex or pleasure or something that is forbidden within purity culture. And so
Mhm.
this thing may really help regulate my nervous system, but I have to make sure that I don't do it sometimes at all, but I definitely don't do it in the context where other people are aware of it. And then I think about the gender binary and how that is applied in these contexts, and how there's very gendered events, very gendered roles, and that can be uncomfortable all the way to painful, depending on what the expectations are and how that aligns with what your actual like social needs and capacity is.
Yeah. I appreciate you naming masking as a survival skill. I think it's important for people to like own it as that or have permission to own it as that, because when we think of neurodivergence through a physiological lens, right, like that would be a situation of I need to survive, I need to stay connected and accepted in order to survive, and so whatever I have to do then to even have the illusion of safety, like I have to go after that.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that can be an added layer of difficulty when someone starts to unmask, whether that's because they're just exhausted and they can't hold the mask anymore, which is what was happening for me at first. I didn't realize it. Or it's an active choice that people are like, well, what happened to you? You're not acting the way you were before. Why are you being so different? What's wrong? And really it's like, no, I'm actually being the most myself I've ever been, but that's not okay with you.
Yeah. This is a little bit out of left field, so if you don't feel like answering it, please feel free to not, and we can cut it out. But I wonder if you can speak to kind of the, I guess, maybe shock and grief of showing up one way. And this is a part of my own story, is that I had a pattern of relationships where like I would show up and probably more in a people-pleasing role and really accommodating, and then feeling, okay, it's safe enough to let down my masks a little bit, and then being rejected because I'm not being that person that I initially was, or maybe I even led you to believe I was, or the person that this other person thought I should be because of religious standards or their own preferences. And I feel like that leads to a lot of rejection and shame. And and I just wonder if you can speak to that, because I feel like that's probably something when we're talking about masking that a lot of people have experienced, is that shame and rejection piece of when I let the masks down and show up as myself and people don't know what to think of me.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I would say maybe everybody who has experienced religious trauma and ended up, whether they're neurodivergent or not, when they have started questioning, deconstructing, and kind of moving out of their faith of origin or their religious spaces, that they've probably experienced some of that, of people like, oh, well, you changed. You're not who I thought you were. And for a lot of people, they try to wear the mask for a while. Like internally, they realize, I don't believe this anymore, but this is my only community, or literally I'm going to lose my whole family. I think that can be really hard. So as you were talking, I was thinking about my experience with that, of going through that process of losing community. Like really, I mean, I worked in ministry. I was also involved in a church. Like my whole world was folks that were within religion. And there was some relationships that I knew as soon as I acknowledged questioning, they were going to be gone. There were others that I thought would survive and didn't. And that is really harmful and really painful. And then in the past 2 years has really been kind of my grief relief cycle of knowing that I'm autistic and walking through some of that again. Not with the religious piece, but with people that I became friends with post, ministry, post religion. I thought that we had really good relationships. And as I started letting the mask down, sometimes almost feeling attacked of like, why are you acting this way? Why has this shifted? Or told you don't care about me anymore. When really it's been like, no, I'm in intense burnout and I am barely like keeping things together. So I can't text you multiple times a day. I just don't have it to give. But there's no room for understanding that. So I just kind of think about how that happens in life, both with religious trauma and with neurodivergence, especially late identified neurodivergence.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate you sharing your story. I deeply resonate with that dynamic. I feel that very much.
Yeah. It's so painful.
It really is.
It is. And then, Stephen, what you even mentioned the burnout part. I mean, not to go on too much of a tangent, but when I departed my own faith, and this is over a decade ago, it was almost an overnight thing. Like one day I was like, in hindsight, I definitely can see it through the lens of like autistic burnout. Like it fits all the markers. I mean, it even came on the coattails of like honestly trying harder than I had ever tried in my life. I had dug deep, tried to like double my efforts, planning to go to seminary. And then I just stopped. I just had no energy to really do anything to do with the church anymore. And then I eventually decided to do a local grad program. And I still remember some church members through a family member asking like, well, I thought you were like talking about me. It's like, oh, I thought you were committed to the ministry. Like, it's like, who says can't still be given this new trajectory? But just, the implication of that. And then just, of course, the religious shame. And actually that does lead to my next question. It's just simply, like, what are some of the unique ways that both you've experienced, but also seen that religious or even sexual shame, like how does that land like in neurodivergent bodies in the nervous system? Like how does that show up?
One of the first things I think about is a tendency to literal thinking that can come for a lot of neurodivergent folks. And so, when you hear those purity culture lessons of like your chewed up gum, it's not something that a person said. It's like, oh, literally, like and in some contexts it can be like if I have even hugged a person that I have a crush on, depending on the context is what, like some context it is intercourse, but some context it is lots of things can be included under that. And then like, oh, I am literally as disgusting as somebody's chewed up, flavorless old piece of gum. Like, and at least for me, the visual then goes to like old piece of gum that's on the ground and now stuck to a shoe and it's really dirty. Like it goes even beyond what is said. And I think that happens for a lot of neurodivergent folks is those visuals that are talked about feel really personal and really vivid. I think going back to what I was saying, like the differences in interoception or like noticing what's happening in your body, there can be a lot of reliance on outside sources to tell you what's happening with your body, with your bodily experience, and also to tell you whether that's an okay thing to be happening or not. So one thing I think about is this very particular kind of like chill feeling that I will get sometimes. And within religious context, that was always like, that's the Holy Spirit. That's how you know it's the Holy Spirit. Well, I still have that sometimes, and I don't think it's the Holy Spirit. Like sometimes I will be, in a therapy session and somebody's sharing something that's really deep and meaningful. It's that same feeling. And I'm like, I feel like this is just connection. Like connection is happening right now. But I had been told this is what your body's doing and this is why it's happening. And then when you have those chronic messages that you're wrong, that you're different, that you're not behaving appropriately, that you're not doing things the right way, like that sense of shame just keeps growing. You feel like you don't belong and you're trying so hard to belong. And then a lot of folks, and this was true for me, you even start questioning like, well, do I even belong with God? Like, God is supposed to be this, all-powerful, omnipotent, loving being, but why is God allowing this to happen and for me to continually be told that I'm not okay and that I don't belong and that I can't do anything right if all of those characteristics are true of God? So it can be a lot of shame just built on top of each other.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's for sure. Especially when you have that theology or doctrine, with like Calvinism, where you're just born inherently unworthy. Yeah. And so it's like baked into your system from the time you're born. And so it makes it very believable, when these messages are coming past, even if they're supposed to be these little lessons, purity culture lessons, like the chewed up piece of gum. It's like, no, that hits at a totally different level when you already believe that you are unworthy at your core. Yeah. There's a few terms that we've kind of thrown around a little bit, and I wonder if we can like kind of expand on them a little bit for people and then talk about how that might impact somebody, a neurodivergent person, and how they internalize purity culture. The terms are sensory sensitivity, emotional intensity, and interoception. So if we can like talk about what those are and then how that might impact somebody, I think that could be helpful.
Yeah. So sensory sensitivity, I think of it as the fact that all of us have sensory needs and preferences. A lot of times for neurodivergent folks, those needs are stronger and they impact your system more. So like all of us have, a certain temperature that we prefer. certain lighting that we prefer, like certain types of clothing that we prefer. But for a neurodivergent person, it may be to the point of like, the lights are too bright, therefore I can't focus on anything, and I am physically physically uncomfortable because of the brightness of the lights. And so just being aware of the fact that that's not only a neurodivergent thing, that all humans have sensory preferences, sensory needs, creating space to honor those as much as you can. I know for me, COVID forced me to go all telehealth. And one of the things I love is that I control the temperature of my office. I control the lighting. I control it all. And that doesn't have to infringe on my clients. They can control their space as well. I think that is really helpful. And then what were the other things?
Emotional intensity and interoception.
So emotional intensity, a lot of neurodivergent folks may experience emotions differently. Some folks may even have what's known as alexithymia, which is difficulty identifying and expressing emotions. And so, whereas for some folks, it may be easy to say, I feel happy, I feel angry, I feel sad. For some neurodivergent folks, that's not easy. I can't tell you. I can tell you that my stomach hurts. I can't tell you why my stomach hurts. I can't tell you what emotion is connected to that. And often when you mix that maybe difficulty with identifying emotions with sensory sensitivities, the intensity of what's going on is super strong. And that's when we'll often hear about meltdowns or shutdowns, where this is a very elementary explanation, but meltdowns are generally when it's coming out. So kind of looking maybe like a tantrum, somebody gets very loud, maybe slamming doors or putting things down forcefully. And shutdowns are generally more internal. All of that can be happening, but it's happening internally. And sometimes people don't notice. I am much more prone to shutdowns. And I find that either people don't notice they're happening, or they think that I got really mad all of a sudden for no reason just because my face went blank.
Yep. I resonate big time. Well, both the meltdowns and the shutdowns.
Well, I learned early on that good Christian girls don't have meltdowns.
Don't have meltdowns. Yes. Yeah. That used to be my MO. And then, then I got tired of the punishments that came with that and went to shutdown. So yeah.
Same. It resonates here too.
Yeah.
And then interoception, this is one of my favorite terms, especially in somatic work. But how would you describe that, especially in regard to neurodivergence?
Yeah. So lots of neurodivergent folks struggle with interoception. And I remember the first time I learned the word and I was like, that explains so much. And it's basically your interoception is just the ability to notice what's happening in your body. So to notice when things shift and change, to notice pain, to notice tension, but also to notice if you're hungry or you're thirsty or you need to use the restroom. And lots of times you will hear neurodivergent folks, particularly ADHDers or autistic folks, talk about getting hyper-focused and then realizing I haven't eaten for 6 hours or I haven't eaten all day. Or suddenly being like, oh my gosh, I have to use the bathroom so bad. Am I going to be able to make it to the bathroom? But it didn't even register until it got to that point of like, oh my gosh, I have to go. And so those differences in interoception can really play a role as well. And can also, I would say in a lot of high control religious contexts, because there is an emphasis on do, keep doing all the things. When you're not noticing what's going on with your body and you're being told from an external source that you have to keep doing all the things, that you have to keep serving in this way, you really can put yourself into neurodivergent or autistic burnout. That you're just chronically exhausted and your body is shutting down.
It's so interesting to just in light of all of this, another personal anecdote. Like, I have quite a few things that are resonating personally, but one of the times I saw a therapist, one of the first times I saw a therapist many years ago, and he did Gestalt and somatic experiencing, and on the note of interoception, he would ask, we were doing things about like where I would notice something in my body or whatever. And I'm like, I did not know. I mean, it was like so frustrating. I mean, I really liked him as as a person and as a therapist, but it was, oh my God, it was frustrating. I'm like, dude, I understand intellectually what you're asking me. I have no damn clue where this is showing up in my body. I just know that I'm getting pissed off at you right now.
Yep.
And in hindsight, I'm like, oh my God, that makes so much sense now. There was just this complete disconnect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's one of the things I'll often say. I'll like ask and I'll be like, I'm just asking. It's okay if you don't notice anything. Like some people do, some people don't. And then kind of talk about it more depending on the person, if it's something that fits or doesn't.
That's fair. Yeah, no, I like that. And you did touch on just a moment ago, burnout. And so we've kind of touched on that theme a little bit. I definitely want to make sure we really speak to this as well. So how do sensory overwhelm or social anxiety in church environments contribute to long-term distress? And then also just how is that often overlooked in trauma recovery work?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, when you think about like churches, religious groups, there can be a lot of sensory overwhelm. Depending on the context, there's lights, sometimes bright lights, strobe lights, spotlights. Can be a lot of different smells, a lot of different sounds, volumes, things like that. There can be various expectations around how you interact with other people. Are you touching? Are you hugging? Are you shaking hands? How close are the crowds? Is there a lot of background chatter happening? And so all of that is things that if somebody has some sensory sensitivities, they're taking in every single piece of it. There's been brain scans that have shown that, particularly for autistic folks, that there are a lot more neural connections happening. And so they're taking in way more information. So something that might not seem like a big deal to a non-autistic person can feel really overwhelming because it just feels so amplified in that environment. And when you're experiencing this ongoing sensory overwhelm and that social piece, the anxiety, the knowing, okay, sometimes I don't get this social stuff right. And so feeling anxious about how that's going to go, like that can really lead to neurodivergent burnout because it's just this chronic feeling of overwhelm and of trying to get it right. And it's important to know that sometimes it can look like depression, but some of the typical treatments for depression can actually make it worse. So often when someone is coming in with depression, something a therapist might suggest is behavioral activation, or like, let's find some things that you enjoy and get you plugged back in, engaging in these activities. For somebody who is in autistic burnout, that is not going to be helpful because actually they just need to rest. They need to be able to just disconnect from all of it and not have to engage with anything. They need support in recognizing that it's burnout. I think both of you have kind of alluded to maybe recognizing periods in your life when you're like, that was burnout. Me as well. Times when it was labeled anxiety or depression, and I'm like, that was burnout. So recognizing that, working with somebody who understands and understands neurodivergent burnout, and that is different than, oh, you need to take a vacation from work. And being given permission to rest. And a lot of these high control environments, resting, not serving, all of that is seen as sinful and bad. And so having permission to rest and to just exist can be so important. And I think for therapists, maybe who are supporting folks that might be having this experience, like moving really slowly through the burnout recovery before you get to even touching on the trauma work. Like being able to give the person space to recover from burnout and get to a point where they are able to initiate, like, okay, I think I'd like to explore this now. I'm ready to talk about it, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I feel like that's so important. And I like, even at the beginning of the conversation, we were putting complex trauma into this space of neurodiversity. To me, that feels, it's like such a natural pairing because when my clients come to me and they are, they say I'm depressed or I'm not functioning the way that I normally am. Yeah, I don't go to the quote unquote typical responses for depression. It's always, well, yeah, like there's been a lot going on. Your body is doing so much. And yeah, it usually is. It's more about making accommodations to how do we navigate this time in a really tender way or sensitive way or way that works for you versus what can we check off the list today and feel good about, you
Yeah.
know? And I think that's so helpful to point out. I really appreciate that.
Yeah. And I think definitely being focused on the person in front of you, on what they need, because like thematic interventions can be so helpful with trauma and also completely overwhelming. So to give that to someone who's already burnt out and overwhelmed, that might be too much to start with. So just being aware of like the person in front of me, what do they need right now? And helping them understand. Because I know, you know, coming into therapy for me, like I had no idea what I needed. I just knew things weren't good.
That makes sense. Yeah. Well, as we kind of move towards like talking about healing a little bit and kind of reframing identity post purity culture, you know, there are many people coming out of high control religions that we said are more of like the late identified neurodivergent person just because of the way that high control religion and purity culture functions. So, you know, just on a general level, what does healing look like for that person who's kind of unraveling religious trauma and purity culture?
Yeah. I mean, I think that builds off of what we were just saying. Like, healing is very complex. It can often feel exhausting for the person who's healing, but sometimes the sessions can be exhausting for the therapist as well, supporting someone who is walking through that. So whether you are a client or a therapist, just being aware of sometimes the sessions can be really heavy. I think some of the aspects that can be helpful in healing is understanding what happened, having some framework for what is spiritual abuse, what do trauma responses look like, how did this show up in my context, what is vocabulary that applies for me. I know for me, when I first came across some vocabulary, it was so freeing because it was like, there's words for this. Okay.
Yeah.
I very vividly remember the first time I came across the term spiritual bypassing and was like, oh, that was happening a lot. Folks were using spiritual words or phrases to avoid actually dealing with what was going on. That was happening a lot. So understanding, learning about the nervous system and emotions and boundaries, like for so many folks coming out of high control systems, none of that was ever talked about, you know. Anything they may have learned about the nervous system might have been in school, but depending on how high control the system was, their schooling may have also been controlled by the religion. Being able to even know what emotions are and that all emotions are acceptable, that they're just information. You know, for me, another thing that I had learned early on is that good Christian girls don't get angry. And so, like, I would all the time be like, I'm just frustrated. And at the point where I realized, like, no, I am incredibly pissed off and angry about this situation. Like, it's so freeing to just be able to say it. And, like, that doesn't make me a bad person. It's not, anger is not bad. It is a messenger that is telling me this is important and something bad is happening. And then learning about neurotypes, especially for late identified folks, like learning how your brain works. And that neurotype is just another word for kind of your brain style or how your brain functions. Learning about that and kind of understanding if you are neurodivergent, what does that mean? What does that mean about how you experience the world? Finding community and being able to find community that understands religious trauma and understands neurodivergent. That can be really hard, but if you can find folks that get both. And I am finding that more and more a lot of people who are coming out of high control religion are having that experience of, oh, I am neurodivergent as well. This applies to me. And then I think finding a therapist who understands it, understands religious trauma, who is supportive and can meet you where you are. I feel like I really lucked out because my therapist that I was working with when I was first kind of coming out of my ministry experience just did a great job of meeting me wherever I was each session, which could really vacillate a lot, but never trying to push an agenda on me, and saw me all the way through from at the very beginning of, but religion is my whole life. I have to hold on to this belief system. I need you to support me in doing that too. I don't actually know if I want to hold on to this anymore. I'm not sure how important it is or what role it plays in my life. And just being able to sit with me in all of that.
That is
Yeah.
huge. What a gift. That's so cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think how lucky I am because I didn't know that's what I needed at the time.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
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 Wow. I love that.
That therapist that you just mentioned, like that's like the perfect anecdote to this question. And 'cause I was just going to ask, how can clinicians and communities support neurodivergent folks in reclaiming their autonomy without inadvertently slipping into new forms of rigid thinking or moral pressure?
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's so important to offer options and explore things and constantly remind the person you're working with that they have autonomy. That just because you're offering something or saying, hey, this might be an exercise to try or this might be something to explore, doesn't mean they have to say yes. It doesn't mean they have to keep trying to do something if it feels bad. I will continually tell the folks that I work with, yes, I am bringing in experience and knowledge and expertise around different interventions and things that can be helpful. And you know yourself. So if I mention something and you're like, I am not going to do that, or I'm not ready for that, tell me that. I always love it the first time that a client tells me no, because I'm like,
Yes.
You trust me enough to use your no. And especially if you're coming out of a high control environment, you didn't learn to do that. So we're going to celebrate that and we're going to honor that no.
Yes. I love that.
I think allowing folks to explore bodily experiences and all kinds of bodily experiences, like this doesn't just have to be sexual. This could be, okay, well, pick a favorite blanket and what is it you like about it? Like, what is the texture of that blanket that you really enjoy? For some neurodivergent folks, the idea of like taking the view of a scientist, if they're trying something new, you're experimenting and you're gathering data. And it's not a failure or a success. We're just experimenting to see what happened and what you noticed about this particular, task or homework assignment or way of doing something differently.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, that scientific approach. It's very like it kind of draws you in. Like, oh, yeah, I can do this. I can be curious. Yeah. I'm curious, what has helped you either personally or professionally kind of move towards more self-trust and gentleness and maybe even embodiment outside of purity culture?
Yeah. I think some big ones for me are time outside of rigid systems, which even though, especially at first, can feel really uncomfortable, being in spaces where people exist in very different ways, and it is okay and acceptable. I initially actually experienced that in some queer spaces when I was in my graduate program, and a part of the work we were doing involved me being in some queer spaces that were different than anything I had ever been in before, and just like, oh wow, there's not all of these rules of how people have to be. So I will seek that out now. For me, learning and reading, like I really like to understand and gather information. So learning things about self-trust and consent and intuition and what does it mean to be aware of what's going on around yourself. And then as I was moving more and more toward, I think I might be autistic, also learning what does that mean? And why was I overlooked? And then also when we're thinking about coming out of purity culture, like learning some basic sex ed, because we didn't get that, so even understanding your body and how bodies work and what things feel good and don't feel good and you might enjoy and you might not, and like how to communicate if you're choosing to involve a partner in things. And then also for me, a big part in the last 5 to 7 years has been having a loving partner who also happens to be neurodivergent and had his own experiences in purity culture. We probably have a lot of conversations that we would not have if we did not both have those experiences and, coming to realizations of like, oh, wow, this is how this impacted me. I didn't know it at the time. So those are some of the things that have been helpful, both professionally and personally for me.
I love that. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I really appreciate you sharing all of that. And so much of your background as well, just like I said earlier, just really does resonate with me personally. Well, as we're getting close to the end, there are some questions I always love asking these to folks. But if you could go back and speak to your younger neurodivergent self, immersed in purity culture, what might you say?
Yeah. I thought about this and I kind of wrote something out that I actually wish I could say to myself. And so what I came up with was that I would like to tell my younger self, there is a reason that this feels both incredibly easy and quite frustrating. Your brain thrives on the rules of purity culture and doesn't comprehend the seeming hypocrisy of others who claim to believe the same. There's a reason you often feel like you're not having the same experience because your brain and your nervous system are not.
Wow. That can be chills.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. I just imagine, hearing that would be so powerful that, younger Michelle or younger Laura, younger Andrew, like that's so powerful because there's so much freedom in what you just said.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just understanding, like, for me, that piece of understanding, like, there's a reason this feels so hard. Like, there's a reason it feels like everybody else got the playbook and you didn't. Because in a sense, it's true.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah. Well, I'm curious to know what gives you hope about how conversations around faith and trauma and neurodivergence are evolving.
I love that more conversations are happening. I don't know, you know how algorithms work. And so I don't know if because I look at a lot of religious trauma and neurodivergent stuff, I'm now being fed things that kind of combine the topics. But I know the discussions are out there. Continuing education discussions for therapists, folks writing Substacks about their own experiences and realizing how they were impacted. I just love that. And really that leads into the fact that so many people are sharing their lived experiences. Because I think it's one thing to have research, to have data, but when somebody is able to share their lived experience of this is what happened for me and this is what it was like and this is how it impacted me. It hits a different spot.
Yeah, that's so cool. Yeah.
What is some concrete step or something or other to folks listening? What is one small sensory friendly or accessible step that someone could take today to begin reclaiming agency after purity culture?
I think one of the biggest things is just noticing pleasurable experiences. And that doesn't have to be something huge, but a lot of times in purity culture, all pleasure is off limits and is seen as bad. And so it could be something like, eating a favorite food and really taking the time to notice the flavor and texture and all the things you like about it, or, taking your dog for a walk, watching a TV show that you really love, like something that you take pleasure in, and then just intentionally noticing what the experience is. Like, do you start smiling? Do you kind of like cuddle up on yourself because you're feeling really comfortable? Just paying attention and noticing, like, okay, pleasure is possible and it can happen in little moments. It doesn't have to be this big, huge thing, and it's not bad.
Yeah, definitely. It's pleasurable. Yeah, I love it. I love it. Well, Michelle, this has been such an incredible conversation. I feel like this is one of my favorite ones that we've had all season because it just has been so enlightening. So for people who are wanting to get in touch with you, follow your work, maybe even work with you, where can they find you? Yeah, social media, websites, all that good stuff.
Yeah. So my website is just my name. So it's michellefmosley.com. I am somewhat active on Instagram, and my handle there is @therapy_with_Michelle. And those are probably the best ways to get in touch with me. I offer individual and group therapy to folks in North Carolina. I also do some continuing education for therapists, and I also offer a mental health kind of 101 workshop for faith leaders, clergy, folks that want to understand mental health and bring that into their faith spaces as well. So I would love to connect with anybody who's interested.
Yes. Well, I will make sure that all of that information gets into the show notes so that people can easily connect with you. But just wanted to say thank you again for such an amazing conversation. I feel like this is going to be so helpful to everybody who listens to it, because there's so many of us that are either realizing this about ourselves or we know somebody else. And it's so important. So thank you. I really appreciate this.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me on. I love talking about this stuff, so it's exciting to be able to talk about it in this context.
Thank you once again to Michelle Mosley for such an amazing interview. I feel like we could have talked for hours. I feel like we should have grabbed like a bottle of wine or cups of coffee and just like, sat and chatted, because I feel like this is maybe one of my favorite interviews that we've ever done. It just felt so resonant to understanding pieces of my own history that have been a bit cloudy. And like even so many clients' experiences that I've been able to witness. So I am just like still taking all of this in and loving so like everything that she was talking about.
Yeah.
What do you think, Andrew?
Yeah, same. I mean, I also one of my favorites, probably because it resonates on a personal level so deeply. I mean, I've been really open about this, but for those who don't know, I was diagnosed with ADHD as an adult, and now also there's a possible chance like some of the autism stuff definitely is also probably a reality, and it's oh my God, like the way that shows up in high control systems.
God,
And the way that it puts so much of even my own experience into a new light that makes so much more sense in hindsight. And I know that I just have a lot of both folks I work with, but also just friends, acquaintances, people I know that have been late diagnosed. And I just know it's going to resonate a lot. Definitely.
Yeah.
There was such limited resources in the church growing up, not only because even just I think secular clinical psychology was still not where it is today, but in the church, so much of even that was just completely discouraged.
Yeah. Well, and so much of it too, it's like not only discouraged, but it's viewed then as a sin issue, right? Like if you have these meltdowns, right? Or even shutdowns, right? That could be seen as sinful. It could be seen as, your emotions having control of you. And therefore, you are living, your heart is leading instead of your wise mind, or the, spirit of the Lord or things like that. And yeah, I think about like, I was described as a very passionate child, and I'm like, okay, or emotionally intense. Like, let's be honest here. And it's like, I don't want to fault family members for not seeing that. But at the same time, I'm like, God, that would have been like really helpful, to have like just some different types of support, and or not to feel like there was a spiritual problem with me simply because I struggled in certain ways, or, or in certain situations. So yeah, I think it's interesting to reflect back on. Every time that I reflect back and I'm like, oh, the childhood thing, this, that, whatever, I'm like, yeah, this was definitely present. And I think life could have been different outside of a high control environment, and or just with the different support,
Oh yeah, definitely. Even without support, even just having the understanding that I do now, I just know it makes such a difference. The clarity of like recognizing like there's nothing wrong with you. Your brain just might work a little different. And this is how it might work different. This is what might be going on for you and why. Even just that alone helps so much.
Well, because it's like you're not fighting against yourself, right? Like I feel like shame can be such a huge component, like the what's wrong with me, or why am I not getting this right, or why is everybody doing this so easily and I'm not? And it's like you're constantly fighting against yourself. And when that is removed, that and replaced essentially, even with neutrality, but maybe even self-compassion, it's like, wow, life becomes so much easier to just live when you're not hating yourself all the time. And you're just like, yeah, I just need some accommodations. Like, no big deal. I can give that to myself or to other people. Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah.
Good conversation. And once again, people, if you are, interested in following Michelle, her information is going to be in the show notes. I know she has courses and works with people one-on-one. I know she's done groups before. And so, yeah, please make sure to connect with Michelle if this conversation resonated with you today. And yeah, give her some love. Tell her that this was amazing. I know I will. So I think with that, all God's people said, amen.
Amen.